In this activity, I will be reading a passage that has been translated from Portuguese into English. Your task will be to focus on the verbs and think about which sentences, if they were written in Portuguese, would use the imperfeito tense. As you listen, pay attention to verbs that describe ongoing actions, background details, or states of being. As you know, these are often expressed using the imperfeito in Portuguese. For example, look for verbs like there was, lived, ran, actions that are continuous or true over a period of time. The text will be divided into 3 parts, and after reading each part, we'll analyze the verbs and try to identify which ones would be found in the imperfeito. At the very end, we will read the entire text again and compare it to the Portuguese version to see how the imperfeito is used in the translation. So, let's now begin with the first part of the text. Many years ago, dozens and hundreds of years ago, in a certain place in Denmark, in the far north of the country, near the sea, there was a great forest of pines, lindens, firs, and oaks. In that forest, a knight lived with his family. Let's think about what you just heard, and now ask yourself, which verbs described the background or setting of the story? Now, here are some instructions. Think again about the atmosphere, the landscape, or descriptions that help you visualize the place. Remember again that in storytelling, these are often expressed using the imperfeito. Now, can you find the English equivalents in the passage? Let's see the text one more time. So, again, many years ago, dozens and hundreds of years ago, in a certain place in Denmark, near the sea, there was a great forest, etc., etc. Now, the verb that we are focusing here is there was. There's also a little particularity about this verb in Portuguese, because unlike English, you guys use the verb to be and another word there, okay, to mix up and talk about existence. Please remember, what is the verb in Portuguese that is going to be the equivalent to either there is or there are in the present tense, or there was or there were, because in Portuguese it is just one word. Can you remember? After you do, now, which tense do you think that verb should be when translating it into Portuguese? Can you pause the video and then answer the question? Okay. The verb is the verb haver. Remember, now haver is a regular verb in the imperfeito. It is in the imperfeito. What do you think? Yes, it is havia. Havia. Remember also to pronounce the H, or actually not to pronounce it at all. There is no sound for the H in Portuguese. So havia. Havia is used to express the existence again of something in the past, continuously or habitually. It's not referring to a single moment, but to something present over time. Think about even the idea of a forest. It takes some time to grow. Okay, so there was a great forest of all those type of trees. Okay, think again about the introduction. Many years ago, we are precisely in storytelling. We have no clue when is many years ago. Okay, so this is a cliched, typical scenario for the imperfeito. Now, in this passage, you can see another verb. A knight lived with his family. Now again, what is the verb to live in Portuguese? Right. Concerning living inside a house, living connected to an address, it is a regular verb from the first conjugation group. So it's the verb Mudar. Okay, now, again, the big question is, should the verb mudar be in what past tense? Go to the text again. Now look at this. In that forest, a knight lived with his family. You can pause the video again and you can see the answer later. All right. Yes, lived. It's also with imperfeito and the verb is murar and the conjugation is murava. Again, murava, just like any other verb written in the imperfeito, describes the knight's continuous life in the forest. Again, it's an action that was ongoing, not a one-time event. So he lived for a very long time in this forest with his family. Okay, so again, you have to think that you're going inside this story, and just like in the other explanations I have given you, you have to think, okay, the knight in the story still lives with his family. In the story, this is still happening. It hasn't been finished yet. Okay, so this is one good example how you would translate this using the imperfeito. Now, let's continue the story and keep on studying and analyzing this text. They lived in a house built in a clearing surrounded by birches, and in front of the house's door there was a great pine, the tallest tree in the forest. In spring, the birches covered themselves with young leaves, light and bright, which trembled at the slightest breeze. Now, let's look again at the second part of the text. Please just listen and picture the scene in your mind. They lived in a house built in a clearing surrounded by birches, and in front of the house's door there was a great pine, the tallest tree in the forest. In spring, the birches cover themselves with young leaves, light and bright, which trembled at the slightest breeze. Now, think about the verbs in this passage. Lived, there was, covered, trembled. I want to ask you a few questions to help us reflect on the use of the tenses. Okay, first question. Which verbs describe the setting or background? Take a moment, pause the video, and what do you think? Okay, so which verbs describe the setting or background? Well, pretty much all of them. Lived, there was, covered and trembled. Fine. Perhaps lived and there was are a little bit bigger in time or in the bigger picture, and covered and trembled, maybe not so much. However, yeah, all verbs actually describe a background. Okay, so these are things that were true for a long time without focusing again on when exactly they started or ended. And you know that this kind of description we would usually be using the pretérito imperfeito. Now, another question. Which actions here happened regularly or habitually? For example, what happens in spring? Think, pause and think. Okay, so do you have the answers already? Yeah, in the text we have covered. In spring, the birches cover themselves. All right, yeah, there's the feeling of a repeated actions over and over again, always in that time of the year. Okay, also trembled. Yeah, when we would have an action, this other action would always happen. Okay, and as you know, whenever you want or we have repeated actions in the past, in Portuguese, yes, we would also use the imperfeito. Okay, another question. If this passage were in Portuguese, which verbs would be in the pretérito imperfeito and why? Again, pause and I'll wait for your answer. If your answer was all of the verbs, well, that would be correct. Yeah, the imperfeito, again, as you know, is used for repeated or habitual actions and also for descriptions of background or setting. And in this passage, all the verbs are either painting a picture, lived, there was, or showing what happened repeatedly in nature. With in spring, the birches covered themselves and trembled at the slightest breeze. So, yeah, we would also use the imperfeito in all of them. Now, even more important, let's now try translating a few of those sentences into Portuguese using the imperfeito. For the purpose, I will just mainly focusing precisely just on the verbs. However, sometimes I have to write a little bit more so we really know who the subject is behind the verb. Because in Portuguese, as you know, the conjugations for every subject, they change. Okay, so they lived, the first one. What's the answer? All right, it is eles moravam. Let's go, number 2. There was, as in there was a great pine. Havia grande pinheiro. All right, now covered and tremble, it's a little bit harder. Look at the text again. Cover themselves. I know the translation is a little bit too literal, but I've made this on purpose so you can understand what type of verb that would be in Portuguese. Think about it. Pause and think about it. So what is the answer? All right, so the verb is cobrir-se. Yes, it is a reflexive verb. Hence, that's the reason why I wrote themselves. So you understand it would be a reflexive verb. Again, it's within the sentence of the birds just cover themselves. And this in Portuguese is as bétulas cobriam-se. All right, now the last one is trembled. Yeah, I can imagine that perhaps you don't know this verb in Portuguese because, well, even in English, the word tremble is not common everyday language. However, why not learning another word? Right, so the verb is estremecer. Careful, that is not what is written there. I'm just giving you the name of the verb, the infinitive. It's an ER verb from the second group. Estremecer. And the conjugation is the one that you can see right now. Estremeciam. So, jovens flores que estremeciam. So, the flowers, okay? The birches would tremble, okay? Estremeciam. Okay, I hope this helped you. And let's go now to the final part of the text. Let's now look at the third and final part of the text. Once again, I'll read it in English first, and then we'll think about which verbs would likely be in the Pretérito Imperfeito if this were written in Portuguese and why. So, let's see. Then the snow disappeared, and the thaw released the waters of the river that ran nearby, whose current sang again night and day among grass, mosses, and stones. Then the forest filled with mushrooms and wild strawberries. The birds returned from the south, the ground was covered in flowers, and the squirrels leaped from tree to tree. The air was filled with voices and bees, and the breeze whispered through the branches. I don't know about you, but this is so beautiful. So let's see now in the next slide, okay? How can we analyze this? Now let's think. In everything I have read, in all the verbs. Now, in the original Portuguese version, all of this is written in the Pretérito Imperfeito. Why? Now, what kind of atmosphere is being created? Go back, okay? All those verbs I have just read. What do you think it's the feeling happening? And if they are all written in the Perfeito, even with verbs such as the snow disappeared, you may think, okay, this is definitely PPS because the snow disappeared has to be one-time event. The same thing when you go back and you can see that the thaw released the waters. Again, you may think, okay, this has to be PPS because you feel like it's a one-time event. And even like the river run nearby. Well, maybe not so much. But there are certain verbs that you would honestly, I understand why I think they are written in the PPS. But the feeling here with all the verbs written in the Imperfeito, and sorry, pause here, remember that this is a literary text, so there's always a slightly different feeling and nuance being added to all this text, okay? So again, let's try to answer. What kind of atmosphere is being created here? Right, so over here, okay, with all the verbs that I will start showing, we are not just listing things that happen at once. We are describing a cycle of nature, a repeated or ongoing scene, something that happened every spring. All these verbs and all of these feelings that these actions give us, they are all part of the rhythm of life in the forest. The snow disappeared, a neve desaparecia. The thaw released the waters. The river ran nearby, the current sang again. All of this. The forest filled, the birds returned, the ground was covered, the squirrels leaped, the air was filled again, and the breeze whispered through the branches. Now, if you look at the translation, yes, exactly. They're all written in the Imperfeito with the first desaparecia and not PPS, desapareceu. Or soltava, corria, recomeçava, enchia-se, voltavam, cobria-se, saltavam, povoava-se, and sussurrava. Okay? Now, also remember that some verbs here, when translating to Portuguese, are logical, reflexive, okay, for us. For that, you have to study what verbs are reflexive and not. That is another topic. Now, the main thing I want you to feel is that even though certain actions you would think that they are one-time event, for the purpose of feeling really the history, seeing what is happening, creating a rhythm that brings you life. Because also this is a story for kids, and there's a lot of fantasy and a lot of descriptions, hence the using of the Imperfeito in all of these passages. Now, let's look at both versions of the text, first in English and then in the original Portuguese. Just like before, I will be reading the three parts, and then all of it together at the end in Portuguese. But what I want to pay close attention is to the verbs. In the English version, again, many of the verbs will be in the past simple, okay? And that's perfectly natural in English storytelling because we often just use the simple past for everything. But now, let's see what happens in Portuguese. But again, let's start. Again, you have that part. Many years ago, dozens and hundreds of years ago, in a certain place in Denmark, in the far north of the country, near the sea, there was a great forest of pines, lindens, firs, and oaks. In that forest, a knight lived with his family. Now, again, all these verbs in English are in the simple past. But now, let's look at the Portuguese. Okay, let's read. Há muitos anos, há dezenas e centenas de anos, havia em certo lugar da Dinamarca, no extremo norte do país, perto do mar, uma grande floresta de pinheiros, tílias, abetos e carvalhos. Nessa floresta morava com a sua família um cavaleiro. Now, what do you notice? You see that havia and morava, okay, are again in the imperfeito and we have just analyzed. But let's continue. Now, they lived in a house built in a clearing surrounded by birches, and in front of the house's door there was a great pine, the tallest tree in the forest. In spring, the birches covered themselves with young leaves, light and bright, which trembled at the slightest breeze. Now, there was one little detail I forgot to mention before, which is, in the original, you may find certain expressions that are a little bit different from the translation or even the word order. But this is perfectly normal because a translation, it's not always or should not always or at all literal. So bear that in mind. Ok, so viviam numa casa construída numa clareira rodeada de bétulas. E em frente da porta da casa havia um grande pinheiro que era a árvore mais alta da floresta. Na primavera, as bétulas cobriam-se de jovens folhas, leves e claras, que estremeciam à menor aragem. Now, precisely what I was just telling you, I want you to notice that in the original we have, about the pine tree, grande pinheiro que era a árvore mais alta da floresta. If you go to the English version, honestly, you will not find this verb at all because the translation is slightly different. Okay? In English, we are not really saying that and in the front of the house's door there was a big pine tree that was the tallest tree in all the forest. No, we just mentioned the tallest tree. We are omitting the verb. So this is one example. Okay, let's finish this. Now, then the snow disappeared, and the thaw released the waters of the river that ran nearby, whose current sang again night and day among grass, mosses, and stones. Then the forest filled with mushrooms and wild strawberries. The birds returned from the south, the ground was covered in flowers, and the squirrels leaped from tree to tree. The air was filled with voices and bees, and the breeze whispered through the branches. Alright, so let's see the final part now in Portuguese. Ok, então a neve desaparecia e o gelo soltava as águas do rio que corria ali perto e cuja corrente recomeçava a cantar noite e dia entre ervas, musgos e pedras. Depois, a floresta enchia-se de cogumelos e morangos selvagens. Então, os pássaros voltavam do sul, o chão cobria-se de flores e os esquilos saltavam de árvore em árvore. O ar povoava-se de vozes e de abelhas e a brisa sussurrava nas ramagens. Just so you know, I was reading from the original book, O Cavaleiro da Dinamarca. This is a beautiful book that I deeply recommend you that you read. Honestly, actually, all books from Sophia de Mello, Breyner, Andresen, they are just amazing, okay? And also, they're for children, they're not big, and they're very beautiful. So, if you want to learn really about Imperfeito, Sophia de Mello Breyner is a great way for you to start, okay? Now, just to conclude all this presentation, you see that all these verbs that are highlighted or in bold in the Portuguese version, havia, morava, viviam, era, cobriam-se, estremeciam, okay? Yes, they're all in the imperfeito. So here's the key question. What effect does this tense have in Portuguese that the past simple does not have in English? Think about that, because there is indeed a different feeling, okay? Sure, when you say this in English, we're all humans and we can also understand, but language modifies our way of seeing the world and it has a deep effect on how we perceive the reality, okay? So really the imperfeito, comparing it to the past, just to the past tense, simple past tense in English, it is really different. So think about these aspects. Think about the atmosphere, rhythm, repetition, background, painting a scenario, okay? So what's the tone of all these verbs that are written in the imperfeito? And do you think that this same passage would be different if we're all in the PPS? Think about everything that you've learned so far throughout this course, okay? And the answer most likely would be yes, okay? If you answered yes, which I hope you did, yeah, it would be entirely different. So, what we can see here is that the Portuguese often uses the pretérito imperfeito not only to talk about habits or ongoing actions in the past, but to paint a real picture, to describe the world as it was. It gives us a sense of continuity and background, a feeling that life was happening all around, not just in isolated moments. And understanding this helps us make better choices when speaking or writing in Portuguese, especially when telling stories. Now, this is the conclusion. I hope you really have enjoyed all this information that I have given you so far. Yes, it took me a little time to finish all of this. You may notice by my hair, etc. But I'm done, and I'm very glad that I have given you all this information. Please, you can write me a message, ask me if you have any questions. There will also be assignments now attached. Do all those exercises and don't hesitate to text me without, with any questions you may have. Okay? Thank you so much and see you next time.